Well, if you didn't notice this morning, I'll mention this evening, Diana is still under the weather, so Jerry's out alone again tonight. We hope she's feeling better soon. Dave is not with us either today, and I noticed that this morning but forgot to say anything. We do have several who have been unable to be out recently. I mentioned some of those this morning. I want you to know how much cards mean to people, except for me, and I really don't pay much attention to them. So if you ever get the urge to send me a card, send it to somebody else and I'll be fine with that. But I go around visiting, and I'm just really pleased at how many of you send cards and how much that means to the recipients, myself excluded. And it's not that I don't appreciate them, it just seems like a waste of money to me to send me a card. But other people really do, and I want you to know that those are doing a lot more good than you realize, and encourage you to continue sending them. As you know, next Sunday is our Friends and Family Day. Our speaker will be Clay Brown, and he'll speak at the Bible class hour, at our 10 o'clock worship, and then again at 1:30. And there will be no 6:30 service next Sunday, Kenneth. And be sure and tell Roger all the way in the back as well. But there is a meal at 11:30, so encourage others to come and worship with us and share in a time of fellowship between our morning and afternoon assembly. And don't forget to sing at 1. The following Lord's Day, I believe that's May the 6th, Harry's going to be speaking at both our morning and evening assemblies. I will be, God willing, with the church at Oakwood Road in Fairmont for a gospel meeting. Then again, June the 10th, I will be out of town, and Harry will be speaking on the 10th at our morning and evening assemblies. Harry doesn't know it, but early in August, I'm going to be away another Sunday. I just don't know yet, Harry, which Sunday that will be, but Harry will be covering for me then as well. Then in September, there are 2 Sundays that I will be away. I'll be at Bridge Street in New Martinsville for a gospel meeting in September, and at Tip City, just near Dayton, that month as well. And Harry's already on the schedule to cover both of those times when I'm away. So it's really good to know that when I'm out of town that Harry's here to fill in the slack. And I've gotten really good feedback. Don't let Harry know this, but really positive things about Harry's preaching. That didn't used to happen, by the way, Harry. I will tell you that. But over and over again, I'm hearing, I just really like to listen to Harry. He is so much better than he used to be. Well, they're still telling me when you get old, you're going to be a good preacher. I wish that's what they were telling me. They used to say, Harry, when you're old, I'll bet you'll be a good preacher. And now they look at me and say, I'll bet when you were younger, you were a good preacher. It's just how it works, brother. So I just want you to know. But I'm being serious when I say I hear really good things, and I appreciate Harry's willingness to fill in my absence, and we'll try to utilize him just as much as we can to keep him busy and before you. Have you ever suffered, experienced pain, had heartache? And if you tell me no, then I'll suggest, Harry, in 2 weeks you talk to them about lying. Because we all understand that it is a part of life to suffer. And the question inevitably is raised, but why? Why is there suffering in this world? And let me tell you at the outset, I really can't answer that question satisfactorily. I can answer it for myself satisfactorily, but probably not for anyone else. I believe that our world started out far different than it is today, with very limited suffering on the horizon. I think if Adam or Eve stumped their toe it would have hurt just as it hurts today. I doubt if they stumped it on the footboard in their bedroom the way I do from time to time. But I do know that if they had done something like that they would have felt pain. Pain is actually a good thing. It is a protective mechanism designed for our good. But the suffering prior to the fall was very, very limited. Certainly nothing like men and women face today. And what changed all of that? The advent of sin. And with the arrival of sin, everything changed dramatically, not for the better, but obviously for the worse. If you go back and read Genesis 3, as a result of their transgression, women would experience far more pain in childbirth. Every time a woman gives birth, she ought to be reminded of the tragedy of Genesis chapter 3. And for men, work just got a lot harder. You would make your keep by the sweat of your brow. And when the perspiration starts falling from your scalp, just be reminded that it wasn't always this bad, that it was because of sin that all of this happened. And somebody will say, but you claim to believe in a divine creator, a God who is all-powerful and benevolent. How could an omnipotent, young people, that's a word, big word for powerful, all-powerful, how could an omnipotent and good God allow suffering as we experience it in this present world? The argument goes something like this. If God is omnipotent and benevolent, why is there suffering? If he is omnipotent, he has the power to prevent suffering. But since he does not, he must not be capable. You see, a benevolent God who is all-powerful, according to human reasoning, would not allow anyone to suffer, and we've already said, but suffering can be a very good thing. Well, if he's benevolent and cannot prevent suffering, then he obviously isn't omnipotent, and so the critics think they've arrived at an argument that is irrefutable. But I would submit to you that there is another factor that has to be incorporated into our response, and that is God desires his creation to have free will. And though omnipotent and good, free will by the very nature of its existence will result in bad consequences for bad choices and bad actions, just as there are good consequences from good choices and good actions. If we don't have free will, then we're little more than Jerry's electronic device. It only does what it's programmed to do. I don't think any of us would find that kind of life appealing. And so the argument just simply doesn't suffice. I believe it's false in the truest sense, and that when we consider God's creation, it is impossible to consider a creation in which the Creator gives the created free will without having negative consequences when we exercise our freedom in bad ways. And that's where sin comes into play. So I have to ask the question, why then do men suffer? And I will provide some answers that are satisfactory to me and I hope are helpful to you. But I come from the text of James chapter 1 because James acknowledges that trials, suffering, is in essence a part of every life, and that Christians respond to it in one way and the world responds to it in another. And if we're going to be the people of God that we profess to be, we need to discover how we ought to respond to difficulties, trials, tribulations, temptations, suffering, and make sure to the best of our ability that we follow the divine prescript. Now, having said that, I will ask the question again, why do men suffer? And we'll begin by saying to you that some suffering simply is inexplicable. We can't offer any kind of explanation. If you want an example of that, I've cited here John 9. It's the story of the men who had been born blind. You may recall in the exchange with Jesus, the question was raised, who sinned that this man should be born blind? Was it his parents, or did he himself in the womb sin? And this is the infliction of divine justice on the sinner. Now, it is commonly believed in the Old Testament, and we see it implied in the New Testament, and many continue to advocate that all suffering is directly tied to sin. It was Eliphaz who makes the statement to Job, whoever perished being innocent. In essence, Job, your situation is explained by your sinful conduct. Of course, Job's response was, well, show me. What have I done to bring all of this suffering upon me? And they couldn't offer a single example of Job's transgression that produced his suffering. That's because sometimes it is inexplicable. Now, being Bible students, you know why Job suffered. He was a test case. God allowed his suffering to prove that righteous men can maintain their righteousness when life crumbles around them. You see, when life comes tumbling in, the last thing you ought to do is renounce God, because you need him now more than you ever needed him before. And Job got it. So he said in chapter 13, verse 15, though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. And that ought to be our attitude no matter what happens in life. But if you're looking for explanation, sometimes there simply are none. On the other hand, some suffering is directly tied to man's inhumanity to man. Did you see the pictures that came out of Syria a couple of weeks ago when what appears to be chlorine gas was used by the Assad forces against their own people? I think some 40 folks perished, and more than 500 were negatively, seriously impacted by that action. The explanation for the suffering in that situation was simply man's inhumanity toward man. And that happens far more than we would like to acknowledge. And the product of those actions is that people suffer, and sometimes they suffer greatly. If everybody behaved themselves, it would be a different world, wouldn't it? And by the way, that's where we started out. I don't know how long after creation the fall occurred, but there was clearly a period between the time when God made man in his image and sin entered the world, and that time was vastly different from what followed and continues to the present, and in fact will continue until our Lord returns. Some suffering is self-inflicted. And I've cited here by way of example, I think this is interesting, smoking. Everybody, or nearly everybody, would agree there are serious problems with smoke. Tobacco is not good. Nicotine is a poison. It's harmful to the body. And we understand that. If you smoke a pack a day for 40 years and you get lung cancer, guess what? You shouldn't be surprised. If you have COPD, that's not shocking, is it? But I would also tell you that overeating falls into the same category. We can wax an elephant, get really eloquent about the dangers of smoking, but almost no one says anything about overeating. That may hit a little too close to home for some of us. But the Bible's not silent. In fact, the Bible says more about overeating than it says about smoking. Did you know that? I can't find a single passage that specifically singles out smoking, but there are there are some that clearly address the sin of gluttony. And that's overeating, if you please. And then there's the indiscriminate use of alcohol and illicit drugs. And there are consequences to those kinds of choices that produce real suffering. And sometimes that's the explanation. And if it were only the people who were guilty that were impacted, it wouldn't be quite so hard to understand. But how many times have you seen a drunk on the highway involved in a serious accident that kills the innocent, and he or she walks away almost unscathed? Doesn't seem fair, and then again, let me remind you, life isn't fair. And sometimes the innocent suffer because of the actions of the guilty. Sometimes suffering is simply the result of bad luck. Jesus talked about a certain tower that fell on 18 men who perished over in Luke's gospel. Had those men done something that brought about that catastrophe upon them? No, they were just at the wrong place at the wrong time. Gibbs doesn't believe in luck. You know who Gibbs is, don't you? He's on Tuesday nights. But the fact of the matter is that there's good luck and bad luck. Good luck can have some benefit. Bad luck can have some real negative consequences. Want an example of good luck? Read the book of Ruth. It was her luck, her hap, her just by chance that she found herself gleaning in the field of Boaz, a near kinsman. And the result of that, by chance, accidental encounter was ultimately a marriage that produced Obed, who produced Jesse, who produced David, the king of Israel, through whom the lineage of Jesus was traced. That's an example of good luck. Sometimes really bad things happen because people have bad luck. And by the way, young people, carrying a rabbit's foot in your pocket won't keep you from having bad luck, nor will it ensure you good luck. A black cat crossing in front of you doesn't mean anything other than you saw a black cat. That's bad luck enough. Walking under a ladder doesn't matter unless the guy on top of it, Mr. Klein, drops a light bulb on your head. That could be bad luck. But things happen just by chance. And again, I will tell you ultimately that all suffering is the price of free will. If we want to be able to live our lives and make choices for ourselves, this is the obvious outcome. So I have to ask a second question. What in the world does this accomplish for us? What is the result of the suffering that we encounter in this life? And God willing, beginning in June, we're going to initiate a study on Sunday mornings from 2 Corinthians. And I believe it's Tim who has chapter 1. And in chapter 1, Paul makes this argument. Tim's going to expound upon it much more than I will tonight. He simply says that when we suffer, we're better equipped to help others who face similar suffering. Let me illustrate for you. If you've never lost someone really, really close to you, you don't have a clue what other people are going through. You may think you do, but you really don't. If you've never lost a limb, I saw a young man yesterday at Chick-fil-A with two boys. They looked to be both under 5 years old, maybe 4 and 2. And he had lost an arm. I don't have a clue how. But those were extremely well-behaved little boys. And he seemed to be handling them just fine, functioning in a wonderful way. I can't begin to understand what it would be like to lose a limb. But somebody who's experienced that could. I had a friend many, many years ago His name was Lloyd Wright. He's dead now. His brother and mother were members of the church in Hundred, West Virginia. Lloyd was a gospel preacher, and when he was a youngster, he lost an arm. I remember correctly as a result of using a crank on an old Model A or Model T. I don't remember precisely which car. Many years ago, we had a member of this congregation who got a broken arm using a crank for a Model A, I believe. Howard Adams was his name. He and Alice have been gone for years, but Lloyd lost an arm. Well, there was a congregation he was working with at the time when a youngster lost an arm, and the parents, everyone tried to console that youngster. But you know who got through to him? Lloyd. Lloyd could say, "Son, I know what it's like. And you're going to be fine. Life will go on. You'll learn to adapt. And you can do whatever you want to do." And that youngster would listen to Lloyd when he wouldn't listen to anybody else, because Lloyd had the experience. He had dealt with what the young man was dealing with. And Lloyd was equipped. When we suffer, maybe God is equipping us to help somebody else along the way. That's the argument of 2 Corinthians 1, 3 through 7. Suffering makes us aware of our own weaknesses and our need for God. In chapter 12, I can't remember who has chapter 12 this summer, but whoever deals with that text is going to be dealing with Paul's thorn in the flesh. Something physical that created suffering for the apostle. Suffering that was so severe that he prayed to God 3 times that God remove it. I don't have a clue what it was. I have my own opinions, but they're no more valuable than yours, and what's the point in sharing mine? But what I can tell you is that God said, "No. My grace is sufficient for you." And it led Paul to acknowledge that it's in weakness that he was made strong. And so it is for us when we face suffering with the right attitude out of it, when we handle it as God would have us handle it, we're made stronger and better. If you were to summarize the words of James chapter 1, 1 through 12, in 3 words, I would submit to you it would be, hooray for trouble. There's something good to be gained from the adversity of life. It may be hard to see at the time, but the time will come when you look back with that 20/20 hindsight and see how the difficulties then prepared you for the now and what life has thrown at you. And James is making that argument in chapter 1. Suffering ought to make us more eager for heaven. I have spent a lot of time dealing with folks near death, the elderly, who would say to me, and so many have, "Roger, I just don't know why I'm still here. I don't know why God doesn't take me." And of course, family will always say, "You don't mean that." Well, yes, they do. You see, if you're a Christian, what we leave behind is nothing compared to what awaits us on the other side. And there comes a time when the burdens here are so great that heaven takes on an even greater appeal, a greater longing. Isn't Paul expressing that in Philippians chapter 1 when he says, "I'm in a strait betwixt two"? He's writing from a prison cell. "I want to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. And yet, for your sakes, it's needful that I remain." But the time would come, and it wasn't all that far off when God would call him home to glory. And he looked forward with anticipation. He was eager for that time to arrive. The most frightening thing for me in the world would be to be destined to just grow older and older and older and more dependent with no way out. But for the Christian, death is the door through which we pass into a better world. What awaits us is indescribably more wonderful than what we leave behind. And the sufferings of life, they really ought to cause us to long for heaven just that much more. How beautiful heaven must be. So, we look at our text and ask the third question: how ought Christians to respond in the face of suffering? And here is the answer that James offers. Respond in a positive way. Not with rage, not with resignation, but with rejoicing. Count it all a joy, brethren, when you face various trials. You say, you can't mean that. Well, when I read something in the Bible, it comes from God. So I never question whether it means what it says or not. It does. There are benefits and blessings to be derived from the suffering we face in this life. And as hard as it may be, we should rejoice that we're counted worthy to suffer for Christ. It's not surprising, at least not to me, that the Beatitudes in Matthew 5 close verses 10 through 12 with "Blessed are they that are persecuted." Persecuted for the sake of the Savior. Happy are the harassed. There are benefits from the suffering that is inevitable in all of our lives. And when it comes, we're to respond in a positive way with rejoicing, not with anger, not with resignation, but rejoicing. We're to respond in a productive way. Suffering is designed to develop patience. Now, patience we generally associate with being laid back and willing to just endure a whole lot. When we were in Charleston last November, our grandson had injured his ankle. He got on a machine in the exercise room that he wasn't supposed to be on and got his foot caught. And so that next day, he wasn't walking. And as a family, we were downtown Charleston going to walk around for a little bit. And he just couldn't do it. He just couldn't do it. So I said, that's all right, I'll just sit in the car with him. I sat in that car for a good 45 minutes, and the boy did nothing but beat on a can the whole time. Now, I could have said, Andy, stop it, and he would have stopped it for about 30 seconds, and then he would just start it in again. I figured it was easier just to listen to it than try to prevent it. So I just patiently endured. And it really wasn't all that big a deal. And that's the definition of patience that people generally associate with the word. But the fact of the matter is that that's not the meaning at all here. What we're talking about when we talk about suffering producing patience is perseverance. Being willing to be tough when toughness is called for. Hanging in there when it might appear easier just to give up or surrender. Suffering makes you stronger and tougher when we respond to it as we ought to. And then, obviously, suffering ought to produce prayer. Where do you turn when life is difficult, the heart is heavy? I know where we ought to turn, to God. Not just when suffering comes, I don't mean that at all, but especially when we find life filled with adversity, we're reminded of just how much we need Him and how important it is to keep the communication lines open, to stay in touch, and to pour out our hearts. I think of Jesus in the garden. just before the betrayal, he's talking to the Father. Father, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me. He knew before the following night he would be held up to mockery. He would be beaten within an inch of his life, we would say, because Romans, not Jews, would carry out the beating. And the lictor had just one restriction. You could beat him as much as you want, but he must not die. Now, the Jews limited to 39 stripes. The Romans had no such limitations. And so they really did beat Jesus to within an inch of his life, so to speak. And then they compelled him to carry his own cross to the place of execution till he fell from the weight of it. And Simon of Cyrene was enlisted to carry the burden as Jesus continued the public parade to his own execution, where they, before the crowds, nailed his hands and feet to the cross, raised it up, and dropped it in the ground, and positioned it so the sun would shine directly in his eyes. And they mocked him. They said, he saved others, himself he cannot save. They spat upon him. They smote him again. Ultimately, he gave up the ghost. He said, it's finished. And his spirit left him. And even then they were not done. A soldier thrust a spear into his side, and blood and water flowed forth. And Jesus knew all of that was coming. Did he want it? No. He said, if possible, let this cup pass from me, but not my will. Your will be done. And that should always be our prayer. There are many things in life that happen that are inexplicable. And the fact of the matter is that bad things happen to very good people, and there are no explanations. And we all have and are and will experience this. But it's okay, because something better is on the other side. Let's keep our mind, our eye on the prize that awaits, no matter what happens in this life. Some things, in my judgment, are often misunderstood. I hear people say of some, they just never have any troubles. And the reality is they have more than their share, but they just handle it with such grace and poise. And others who complain and cry out and say, I'm just overwhelmed. How could God give me so much? When the truth is known, really have very little. The Bible doesn't promise us, if we're faithful Christians, that our load will be lighter, or that if we're wicked sinners, our load will be greater, because the rain falls and the sun shines on the righteous, the unrighteous, the just, the unjust. And it may not seem fair, but sometimes we just need to see the big picture, folks. We are continuing our study of Acts. In 2 weeks, Tim is going to be leading you in a study of Acts 17 and Paul's ministry in Athens. If you go all the way back 10 chapters to the 7th chapter of Acts, you get the story of Stephen, mighty Christian warrior, the first martyr in the cause of Christ. And it's such a tragic, tragic story. But what happens when 7 closes and 8 begins? As a result of the events in 7, the death of this first Christian martyr, Christians leave town, going in all directions. And the record says they that were scattered abroad went everywhere, preaching the word. Out of that tragedy, God accomplished something really great. the spreading of the kingdom, the salvation of souls. You just never know when the heartache of the present will produce tremendous fruit to the glory of God in the future. And therefore, when troubles come, and they come to all of us, we'll follow the admonition of James and respond in a positive way, in a productive way, in a prayerful way, and with God's help, come through and out on the other side, just like Job, better than we were at the start. That's my take on suffering tonight. I hope it's in some way helpful to you, and yet I acknowledge that there are more questions than I could ever begin to answer, and many of them that I have no answer to give. But one thing I do know, God is in charge, and whatever life holds for any of us, with His help, we can overcome and ultimately be with Him eternally. I want you to take that with you as you leave tonight, and know whatever lies ahead, you do not face it alone. And when you need Him most, He'll never let you down. But you have to be one of His in order to really rely upon Him. Are you a Christian? And if not, are you ready to obey Jesus? We will sing the song that Brad has selected, and if you really believe, we invite you to come. We'll take your confession from a penitent heart and immerse you into Christ, where you will be burying an old man and a new man will be raised to walk in newness of life, cleansed by the blood of Jesus and prepared for whatever lies ahead. If we can